He died by hanging, but not as he had expected. Benito Mussolini, the man who called himself Il Duce, ended his life not on a throne or in a palace, but upside down, hanging next to his lover at a gas station in Milan. His end was as brutal as the dictatorship he imposed, as sudden as the collapse of the empire he dreamed of. What happened in those last days of April 1945 remains one of the most shocking and symbolic moments of the end of the Second World War. Mussolini was born with an overwhelming ambition. From a young age, he dreamed of leading Italy, restoring the glory of the Roman Empire, and becoming an immortal figure. His path to power was built with fiery speeches, paramilitary marches, and political violence. In 1920, his group of black shirts marched on Rome, and King Victor Emmanuel III, fearful of a civil war, handed him power. From then on, fascism took hold of the country. Propaganda presented him as the savior of the nation, the strong man who would restore order and discipline. But behind the charisma and speeches hid a regime based on repression, fear, and censorship. Mussolini eliminated opposition parties, imprisoned dissidents, and filled the streets with symbols, parades, and loyalty oaths. Italy became a stage where obedience was mandatory and free thought dangerous. His ambition led him to shake hands with another dictator, Adolf Hitler. Together they dreamed of dominating Europe, but that dream would end in ruins. In 1939, when the war broke out, Mussolini believed Italy could win alongside the Axis. He ordered invasions, military campaigns, and persecutions. However, his armies were not prepared. The defeats in Greece, Africa, and Russia weakened his image. The promises of greatness turned into hunger, destruction, and death. As the Allies advanced, the Italian people began to hate the man who had led them to catastrophe. In 1943, the Fascist Council dismissed him. He was arrested and imprisoned in a mountain location, but Hitler rescued him shortly after, installing him as the leader of a puppet government in northern Italy. He was just a shadow of his former power. The partisans, resistance groups formed by civilians, began to gain strength, attacking trains, destroying bridges, and liberating towns. The war was coming to an end, and with it, Mussolini's reign. In the last days of April 1945, the Duce attempted to escape. He knew the Allies were approaching from the south and that the partisans were waiting for him on every road in the north. He traveled disguised as a German soldier, hiding his face under a helmet and a blanket. By his side was his lover, Clara Petacci, who refused to abandon him. She knew the danger she was in, but preferred to die with him rather than leave him alone. The convoy advanced through mountains and destroyed villages, seeking the Swiss border. Mussolini still believed he could escape, negotiate, perhaps hide. But fate caught up with him in the town of Dongo, on the shores of Lake Como. There, a group of partisans stopped the caravan and searched the vehicles. One of them recognized his face under the German helmet. It was the end. There was no resistance. The man who had directed millions of lives was reduced to a trembling prisoner, without an army, without power, and without escape. The partisans knew who he was. They had seen him on posters, in speeches, in portraits hung in all the schools and squares. That face was the face of the dictator who had condemned thousands to death, who had filled the prisons with opponents, and allowed Italy to fall under Nazi domination. There was no doubt. He had to pay for everything. They transferred him under guard, while rumors spread throughout the region. "The Duke has been captured," it was whispered. The decision came quickly. There would be no trial, no final speeches. The country was in ruins, the war almost over, and the people demanded immediate justice. On April 28, 1945, in a small village called Giulino di Mezzagra. Mussolini was taken from his hiding place, along with Clara Petacci. Both knew there was no turning back. The partisans lined them up against a wall. Petacci cried, begged for her life and for her lovers. Mussolini, silent, seemed resigned. He wore a dark coat, his face pale, without the arrogance of the past. Years of absolute power had been reduced to that instant. A man, a wall, and the sound of metal being loaded. At 4 in the afternoon, the gunshots broke the silence. They fell together. Without ceremony, without glory, without goodbyes. They say fate does not forgive. And if you find history as shocking as it is sad, subscribe to the channel to learn more endings like this. After the execution, the partisans loaded the bodies onto a truck. They did not want to hide them. They wanted the whole country to see what had happened. They drove to Milan, to Piazzale Loreto, a place with immense symbolic weight. There, months before, the fascists had hanged 15 partisans as a warning. Now, history was being reversed. In the early hours of April 29th, the bodies of Mussolini, Clara Petacci, and several members of his entourage were hung upside down from a metal beam at a gas station. The crowd gathered immediately. Some cried with rage, others laughed, others simply watched in silence. What had been a symbol of power was now a trophy of the people, vengeance mixed with relief. For years they had lived in fear, and that image, the dictator reduced to a hanging corpse, marked the end of an era. The crowd hurled insults, spat, and beat the bodies. The scene was dantesque, almost medieval, but loaded with meaning. All of Italy needed that closure. The public humiliation was not just a punishment, it was a collective purge, a way to symbolically bury fascism. The Duce's body, bloodied and twisted, showed that absolute power has a price. Photographs of the moment went around the world. In black and white, the body of Mussolini hanging next to Clara Petacci became an icon of the fall of fascism. There was no funeral, no ceremonies. The bodies were removed, buried in secret, and for years, the location of his grave was kept hidden to prevent it from becoming a shrine for fanatics. His family asked for the remains, but the Italian government refused for more than a decade. Only in the 50s were they returned, and even then, the burial was conducted under strict surveillance. The shadow of the Duce was still dangerous, even in death. Mussolini's end contains a lesson that transcends time. His power was born from fear, grew with propaganda, and died by the rage of the people. For over 20 years he ruled with an iron fist, convinced he was indispensable. But at the moment of his capture, there was no army to defend him, no ideology to save him. He was alone, reduced to his humanity. His fall was also a mirror for other dictators. Hitler, upon learning of his execution, understood that the end was inevitable. 3 days later, he committed suicide in his bunker. Mussolini's hanging corpse was the final warning that even the most feared leaders can fall in a humiliating way. The most ironic thing was that Mussolini had always admired Roman greatness. He wanted to be remembered as a new Caesar, an immortal conqueror. But his legacy ended up stained by blood and betrayal. The walls where he was shot became monuments to the memory of the victims of fascism. And his name, which once inspired respect, is now spoken as a synonym for tyranny and ruin. History does not forget symbols. That is why the body of Mussolini hanging in Milan remains one of the most powerful images of the 20th century. Not only because it shows the end of a dictator, but because it reveals what happens when fear is broken and justice is imposed from below. It was the moment when Italy stopped being a prisoner of one man and regained its voice. Today, almost a century later, His story continues to be a warning. Leaders who build their power on fear end up falling under the weight of their own terror. Mussolini believed he was invincible, but history showed that no regime, however brutal, can escape the justice of its people. He died by firing squad, humiliated, and hung as a trophy. And although he tried to leave his mark on history as the founder of an empire, the only thing he achieved was to become a reminder of the fleeting nature of power. His fall was the final act of a national drama that left deep scars, but also opened the way for a new Italy, free from fascism and aware of the cost of blind obedience. The brutal end of Benito Mussolini was not just the execution of a man, but the destruction of a myth. And perhaps that is why it remains one of the most shocking stories of the 20th century. Do you think Mussolini deserved that end, or should he have faced a fair trial? I read you in the comments. Subscribe now for more stories from our world.